At the start of June 1944, a massive Allied armada set out to enact the first stages of retaking enemy-occupied territory in Europe. Also in the start of June 1944, a massive Allied armada set out to enact the first stages of retaking occupied territory in the Pacific. Yep, June 1944 saw not one, but two massive Allied invasion fleets deployed, one to the beaches of Normandy and the other heading for the Marianas Islands, the first true rock and soil islands that the US would be aiming to permanently deprive the Japanese of, since previous assaults had either been on islands that were contested and never fully in Japanese hands, or on coral atolls and other similar locations that, while islands by the technical definition, were of understandably limited size and scope. The targets for this fleet of more than 600 ships and over 127,000 troops were considerably larger than those, and potentially the target could be far more heavily defended. There were three main objectives: the islands of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, with Saipan first on the list. Guam would be invaded next, and then the forces on Saipan would be moved over to take Tinian after they completed their initial objective. Admiral Raymond Spruance was in overall command, with Admiral Mitcher in charge of the carriers and Admiral Lee in charge of the battleships. The plan was for land-based aircraft to engage Japanese aircraft based in the Caroline Islands near Truk, while the carriers would stay close to the landing forces, as by now US intel reckoned the Japanese Navy might have up to 9 carriers ready to confront the invasion. Spruance personally didn't think the Imperial Japanese Navy was going to attack him, as General MacArthur's recent operations in the Southwest Pacific had offered a far more tempting target, and the Japanese hadn't gone after him, so why would they go after the Fifth Fleet, which was much, much stronger? Nonetheless, though, he made preparations just in case he was wrong. As it turned out, this was a good idea, since over on the Japanese side of things, part of the reason they hadn't gone after MacArthur's forces was because the Japanese had worked out that the Marianas, or something like them, would be next on the US Navy's shopping list, and they were gathering their strength specifically to counter this assault. Initially, there had been some internal debate as to where the US Navy was going to strike next, but then US recon efforts and preparatory strike efforts on the Marianas had rather signposted the US interest in that area fairly well. Since taking Saipan or any of the other nearby islands would break the Imperial Japanese Navy's line of defense which kept long-range bombers away from the home islands, at least when they weren't mounted on carriers, it was decided that the Imperial Japanese Navy would try for its long-coveted decisive battle. Under the command of the newly appointed Admiral Ozawa, pretty much any major Japanese warship that mattered and was still afloat began to set sail. But the Japanese faced a problem. The majority of their fleet carriers were but distant memories. Although they still had their 3 largest purpose-built fleet carriers, the Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the recently commissioned Taiho, the remainder of the on-paper rather formidable 9-carrier fleet was made up of a pair of converted liners, the Junyo and Hio, which were about half as capable as the big carriers, and 4 light carriers converted out of seaplane and submarine tenders, the Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, each of which was about 1/3 as capable as the big fleet units. Thus, the 9-carrier fleet, in terms of carrying capacity, equated to around about 5 and a bit fleet carriers worth of aircraft capacity. These ships, along with their auxiliary supply forces, were supposed to be backed up by a rather extensive submarine picket line, but many of those subs would be sunk in the weeks leading up to the American landings on Saipan. 3 battleships, the Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato, together with battle cruisers Kongo and Haruna, backed up the carriers as heavy escort, together with numerous cruisers and destroyers that escorted everything that was larger than they were. But apart from having to rebuild the Imperial Japanese Navy's air groups for the nth time, the simple fact was that the carriers still weren't operating quite at capacity, due primarily to a shortage of pilots, even relatively untrained ones. Split into 3 divisions, you had A Force, which had the 3 fleet carriers, and carried just over 200 aircraft, which was about 80% of their theoretical capacity. B Force, with the 2 Hios and Ryuho, were mostly full, carrying about 135 aircraft, as was the Van Force, which, with just under 90 aircraft, was again pushing around about maximum capacity. Altogether, this came to somewhere in the region of 425 aircraft, depending on if you count scouts and spares. Now, in theory, that's actually quite a major force. It's more aircraft than the Japanese had had at Midway. It was more even than they'd had at Pearl Harbor. But the problem was, this was not 1941. It was 1944, and the enemy gets a vote as well. And this particular enemy happened to be the US Navy. The US fleet was a far cry from the one battered fleet carrier that they'd had left in action at the end of 1942. Although it was only 18 months later, the forces now sailing under Spruance's command eclipsed the entire pre-war US carrier fleet by some margin. Not only had the fallen ships of 1942, the Yorktown, Hornet, Lexington, and Wasp, all been reborn in Essex-class form, the good old Enterprise was still present, and along with them were the Essex and the Bunker Hill. Accompanying these fleet carriers were the light carriers Belleau Wood, Bataan, Cabo, Monterey, San Jacinto, Princeton, Cowpens, and, cap off the memorial of lost aviation ships of 1942, the Langley. Between them, they fielded near enough 900 aircraft, and most of them were new Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers, with the occasional Corsair and a few Dauntlesses along for the ride, while many of the Japanese aircraft were still the Vals, Kates, and Zeros that had seen them through the majority of the war, albeit there were some newer versions of these aircraft in the various hangars. There were also a handful of the newer Jill and Judy strike aircraft thrown in for good measure. Likewise, instead of having 1 or 2 hastily scrambled fast battleships as in 1942, Admiral Lee's forces now contained 7 fast battleships, including 2 Iowa-class, meaning that he had under his flag every single operational fast battleship then in US service, with the exception of the Massachusetts, since the Wisconsin and the Missouri had only just commissioned and they had yet to operationally deploy. So powerful was this force that there were 5 additional older battleships and no less than 7 escort carriers, each of which had an air group that was comparable in size to that found on the 4 Japanese light carriers, and they weren't even part of Spruance's main battle force at all. They, and a significant number of cruisers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, were purely dedicated to escorting and supporting the amphibious invasion fleet, which was a separate unit. Although not aware of the precise details of American fleet strength, the Imperial Japanese Navy was nonetheless aware that they were likely to be somewhat outnumbered and outgunned. And so they made plans to try and mitigate this problem using 2 primary factors: the defender's advantage and the long-range nature of Japanese aircraft. The first factor meant that there were a number of Japanese-held islands, most notably Guam, in range of Saipan, and any fleet that wanted to attack it. So part of the plan was to surge large numbers of aircraft to airfields on those islands in order to support the carrier-based aircraft. This would bring up total numbers. Secondly, since most Japanese aircraft had a range advantage compared to their American counterparts, it was also decided to launch attacks from beyond the range of the US carrier fleet to respond. This would keep the Imperial Japanese Navy's precious carriers safe. The strikes could be guided in by reports from land-based aircraft and highly skilled navigators on a select few carrier-based aircraft, and if the carrier-based aircraft couldn't make it back to their home ships on their own fuel, a situation which would vary depending on the make, model, and loadout of the aircraft in question, they would be able instead to land at the nearest Japanese-held island airfield, refuel, and then, if the battle was won or was on hiatus, return to the carriers, and if the battle was still ongoing, they could rearm and strike again from the islands, ideally collaborating with their fellows who would be launching in second or third waves from the carriers. Even if the battle went badly, in theory the fleet should be able to withdraw without any loss. And if it went well, then they could of course close in, conduct follow-up strikes, and then send in the surface fleet. Spruance's objective was fairly clear to him. He had to facilitate the landings on Saipan and then support them. If the Imperial Japanese Navy interfered, he needed to protect the landings from said interference, but how exactly he was going to do that had been left up to him. Some admirals would have actively gone hunting for the Japanese fleet, but Spruance was more cautious. From broken codes and captured enemy plans, he was quite aware of the Imperial Japanese Navy's predilection for complex plans that bypassed enemy forces, and it was possible that any attack directly to his front would also try to slip a fast surface force around the flanks to hit the landing zones. And so he resolved to fight defensively, letting the enemy come to him, since in the end, if the troops attacking Saipan were simply allowed to do their job, the end result would be the Japanese losing the island, which was the whole point. Whether or not he had to fight a sea battle to ensure that this was the case was not as important to him as meeting the overall objective. With the landing scheduled for the 15th of June, less than 36 hours before they were due to begin, the submarine USS Bowfin, which you can now visit as a museum ship in Hawaii, radioed a contact report. It had spotted 4 battleships, 6 cruisers, and various escorts heading towards Spruance. It seemed the Imperial Japanese Navy was on the move. But since the sighting report didn't include carriers, Spruance decided to let the landing preparations continue. But he also started preparing to enact contingency plans, just in case. After all, the Japanese were known for operating powerful surface groups separately from their carriers, but as part of one overall plan. And if Bowfin had spotted a detached surface element, it was possible that there was a carrier element or elements still out there, just out of sight of that particular submarine. And so he arranged for long-range seaplanes to intensively patrol the oceans nearby, and he ordered 2 carrier groups who had been scheduled to go after Japanese air bases on Iwo Jima to be on hot standby for recall. Estimating from the position of the report roughly how long it would take the Japanese to reach strike range of the Saipan area, he ordered the fleet to refuel on the day prior to that calculated date, so that everyone would be running on near full tanks and the logistical ships could fall back to safety further to the east. The 15th of June 1944 came and went, and as the sun set, there were 20,000 Marines ashore on Saipan. But as the moon rose, a report came in from another submarine, the USS Flying Fish. It had spotted carriers and battleships, although it wasn't sure of numbers, exiting the San Bernardino Strait in the Philippines. If they were proceeding at speed, they would arrive in 3 days, which meant that their aircraft would be able to strike just as the landings on Guam were scheduled to begin. Spruance ordered his free-roaming carrier groups that had been sent to suppress other nearby islands to conduct just a single day of strikes and then return to his overall command. He wanted his entire fleet ready by the 17th, the day before the Japanese arrived, and of course also the designated refueling day. On the 16th, the submarine USS Seahorse reported yet another enemy force, this one northeast of Mindanao, and only 2 days steaming away. It seemed to Spruance that multiple enemy groups were closing in on him, and they all seemed to have timed their arrival for the same day. The risk of them hitting the Guam landings just at the crucial stage of when troops were going ashore was too great, and those landings would have to be delayed. But the landings on Saipan were already well underway, and that process could not now be stopped. Admiral Turner, in charge of the amphibious forces, was loath to withdraw his transport ships as their supplies and the medical facilities on the hospital ships attached to them were badly needed, but he was also equally loath to leave them as sitting ducks for swarms of Japanese aircraft. Spruance ordered him to send anything he didn't absolutely need east immediately, and then ordered every available warship to stand by for action and prepare to sail west. Any nearby airfields would be attacked by carrier aircraft immediately to try and suppress any enemy assistance that might otherwise be awaiting the Imperial Japanese Navy's arrival, and even the older battleships of Turner's bombardment force showed up just in case their services were needed. But they were too slow to keep up with the main fleet, so they were deployed as a final stop line, just in case any flanking enemy forces managed to sneak past the main fleet. Despite these efforts, he would still have to reckon with the airfields on Guam and the other nearby islands. Although Mitcher's carriers had hit them hard, with US forces now drawn away to confront the Japanese fleet proper, there was nothing stopping replacement aircraft from being flown in and quick repairs to any cratered runways being made. Then, on the evening of the 17th, the submarine USS Kavala, now also a museum ship down in Galveston in Texas, albeit in a much altered Cold War form, reported that the Japanese ships appeared to be dancing at the edge of the fleet's engagement range, rather than seeking to bull rush the US formation. Spruance concluded they were trying to bait him out, since not all the previously reported Japanese formations had been accounted for yet. But since he wasn't about to leave the landings unprotected, the Japanese would have to be the ones to decide when and where the dancing stopped and the fighting began. On the 18th, it was time to finalize the tactics. Admiral Lee was asked if he wanted to take his fast battleships and try and hit the Japanese at night. Although he was the decisive victor of the fight between Washington and Hiroshima, Lee declined on several grounds. Some of his ships were not as well trained in night actions as the Washington had been that fateful night, and additionally, some of the ships were simply new to formation operations, and with the area they were operating in known for strange disruptions in the electromagnetic spectrum, something like the radar and communications blackout that had seen the South Dakota battered back in late 1942 could prove far more fatal in this environment. Plus, if he left, it would leave the carriers largely unprotected in case there were elements of the Japanese fleet that were a lot closer and coming from a different vector compared to what everybody thought. Instead, Spruance, Mitcher, and Lee arrived on a layered defensive formation. One carrier task group was attached to Lee's battleships in close support, and this formation was sent somewhat towards the Imperial Japanese reported location. The idea was for them to act primarily as very spiky bait, with the carriers emphasizing combat air patrol operations. The idea being that Japanese strike formations would ideally stumble across this force first, which would deploy in it with a skirmish line of battleships leading, and then the Japanese would either be forced to fly through the massed fire of the battleship's formidable anti-aircraft batteries plus those of their escorts, then be savaged by the combat air patrol, if they hadn't got to them before they hit battleship anti-aircraft range already, then be hit by the anti-aircraft fire of the carrier task group and its escorts, and only then would the survivors have any chance of damaging an American flat top. And then they'd have to repeat the entire process in reverse to try and escape. Alternatively, and ideally, after being hit by the combat air patrols, they'd try and attack the battleships, which, with their considerable armor protection and their freedom to maneuver regardless of wind conditions, which the carriers needed for flight operations, would be well placed to endure the assault, with the carrier's combat air patrol then hovering in the wings to pounce when Admiral Lee's gunners gave the Japanese flyers their final permission to die. The other three carrier task groups would sit between this force and the landing zones on Saipan. They'd have their own combat air patrol up and ready to reinforce, but they would also have some strike aircraft ready just in case an opportunity for a counterstrike happened to come their way. At 0600 on the morning of the 18th, the two fleets were around 420 nautical miles apart. This was considerably beyond the 325-mile search radius of US Navy carrier scouts, but it was within the range of their Japanese counterparts, plus, of course, the various twin-engined land-based bombers that had been spotted on the edges of the US formations. Some of Ozawa's scouts duly reported Lee's forward-deployed ships, although this was not a free action. A number of the scouts were spotted and shot down by a variety of US aircraft. Some of these interceptions were what you would expect, Hellcats, but others that claimed early kill tallies included a number of Helldivers and one mildly amused Avenger, who found a Jake float plane sailing along, and, delighted to come across something that was even slower and less maneuverable than itself, the Avenger promptly shot it down. As the day went on, the last remnants of US forces that had been dispatched in earlier days to sweep nearby islands returned to their allocated positions. But overall, Ozawa was building a picture of roughly where the Americans were. On the other hand, the US Navy had been restricted to intelligence from their submarines, and the fact that the Imperial Japanese Navy's scout aircraft were clearly around, which meant the Japanese were somewhere, probably to the west. The wind that day was coming from the east, which was a little bit annoying because it meant that every time the US ships wanted to launch aircraft, they had to turn and steam away from the engagement area, whereas the Japanese ships could simply point their bows at the enemy and keep going. At 0730, the Kavala reported that she was in a one-sub pursuit of a large enemy force, which had closed from 800 to 700 miles from Saipan overnight. Spruance thus elected to change his plans slightly. He would maintain the overall layout of his formation, but he would search westward by day, but then if the enemy refused to play during the day, he would then drop back eastward at night. This was supported by Lee, who was completely confident in his fleet's ability to annihilate any Japanese surface force they came across during a day action. Since Ozawa's scouts had seen and reported various enemy formations, at least those that had survived had done so, he elected to change course from northeast to southwest. This would keep the range open overnight, just in case the US forces pressed west during the darkness. The Japanese light carrier group, acting on its own initiative, was actually in the process of launching a late afternoon strike, with the idea being for the aircraft to land at the much closer airfields on Guam, which could also be more easily illuminated, and then join in the main attack the next day, but then the order came in to change course and they were forced to recall their aircraft. Ozawa instead signalled the island bases to be ready to launch their attacks the next day. He reckoned that his 9 carriers were facing 12 enemy. This was a difficult problem in itself, but it wasn't one that the land-based aircraft wouldn't be able to tip the balance on. In actual fact, Spruance had 15 fleet and light carriers, plus the escort carriers to call on if things got really dicey. But Ozawa didn't know that. Some in the US fleet chafed at the defensive setup. They wanted to continue charging down the Japanese fleet and hit it early the next morning, but Spruance remained adamant. His job was not personal glory, it was to defend the troops landing on Saipan, and so the fleet would stick to his plan. The early morning of the 19th brought further radio intelligence that seemed to confirm that the Japanese flagship was in fact part of the group Kavala was chasing. But then came a garbled report from the submarine USS Stingray. She was almost 150 miles south of Kavala, but she was also being jammed. Possibly, it was thought, by a flanking force that she'd discovered that really didn't want anyone to know it was there. Mitcher again asked to launch an attack on the main force in the pre-dawn darkness to try and hit them as the sun rose, which, apart from being all dramatic and leaving the rest of the day for further attacks, would also mean that the sun would be directly in the eyes of the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners. But the possibility of the flanking force that Stingray may or may not have spotted made up Spruance's mind, and the US ships instead continued to head back towards Saipan. Radar-equipped search aircraft were scouring the seas during the night, but the only one to make contact with the Japanese forces was a land-based multi-engined aircraft that wasn't able to get through radio interference to make its report. And so, it was now time for the opening moves of the battle itself to begin. At 0300, Ozawa orders his fleet to head roughly northeast, beginning their attack run. At 0445, 16 Japanese scout aircraft are sent skywards to find and fix US carrier forces 15 minutes after local dawn. They scout a wide arc, including the flanks, just in case there's a rogue US carrier group out there looking to repeat the surprise assault on the Japanese carriers that had transpired at Midway. 8 of these scouts would be shot down by US aircraft later on, but their simple failure to return spoke volumes about the direction of the enemy forces. At 05:15, a second wave of 14 Japanese scout aircraft are sent up. Once more, 8 of these would fail to return, almost all on the same vectors as the previous 8 who'd failed to come back. At 05:30, a third wave of 13 scouts are launched from the Japanese fleet. These, by and large, are using faster and more modern aircraft than the previous scouts, and they're expected to have a slightly better survival chance if they run into the enemy. At 05:47, VF-28 claims the first kill of the day when their Hellcats take out a Judy bomber which is found on recon patrol. At 05:50, the score is opened down at sea level as Destroyer Squadron 53 comes under attack from strike aircraft launched from the Japanese island bases, probably from Guam. 2 of these are shot down in exchange for no damage to US ships, but the Japanese aircraft also managed to spot Task Group 58.1 beyond the destroyers, and they radio in the sighting report. At 0600, the sun finally crests fully over the horizon, just as 4 Hellcats mistakenly shoot up a Martin Mariner on recon patrol. At 0605, fighters from a number of the light carriers begin sweeping the skies over Guam to suppress Japanese strike aircraft based there, while scouts aboard the US fleet carriers begin warming up for their dawn patrol. At 0700, the main force of Ozawa's scouting aircraft begin to appear in earnest on various radar screens, and combat air patrol fighters are vectored in to take out as many of them as possible. As we've seen, they'll be fairly successful. At 0730, a Jake floatplane, having survived and on its way back home, spots Admiral Lee's battleships and the carrier task group that's with them. The extensive nature of the report and the large size of the formation immediately becomes the focus of attention aboard the Japanese carriers. At 0800, the Japanese Light Carrier Division begins to send 69 aircraft aloft. 45 of them are Zeros armed with bombs, 16 are Zeros in a pure fighter configuration, and 8 are some of the latest B-6N torpedo bombers. They also send up a pair of older B-5Ns, but these are loaded with expert navigators, which will act as a combination of final confirmation scouts and guides for the rest of the air group. With no fighters aboard really to speak of, the Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho then turn to withdraw to the west, with their aircraft instructed to come back if possible, but more likely to land at Guam and rearm and refuel if their fuel reserves won't allow for it, which they probably won't. At 0900, the Japanese fleet carriers begin launching their own strike formation, made up of 128 aircraft consisting of 53 dive bombers, 27 torpedo bombers, and 48 fighters. Their numbers are slightly reduced when Japanese light carriers accidentally open fire on them as they pass, but they press on regardless. And just a quick note about the timestamps being used. These are unified timestamps presenting a coherent picture of the battle because, of course, Japanese timestamps reflect where they were and Tokyo time. American timestamps reflect where they were and are based on Hawaii time. So you may read different accounts of the battle where the timestamps are slightly different, but the gaps between the various incidents will remain the same. It just depends which particular time zone that author has decided to use for this record. But in any case, all was not well in the Japanese formation, though. Even as aircraft were leaving the deck, the submarine USS Albacore had managed to draw a bead on the carrier Taiho. Although she managed to loose torpedoes from all 6 forward tubes, the submarine then had to deal with the far more immediate problem of surviving a counterattack from escorting destroyers, and was thus unable to observe exactly what happened next, except for listening over the sub's hydrophones. 2 of the torpedoes turned out to be tracking straight for the Japanese flagship. One of the pilots, Sakio Komatsu, spotted them coming, and he dove his aircraft into their path. He perfectly timed his final strike, taking out one of the torpedoes with this last act. But unfortunately there were no other pilots alert enough to repeat the trick, and the remaining torpedo would strike home. Although Taiho settled by about 4 feet at the bow as a result, the massive carrier was in theory able to withstand a single torpedo strike, and soon the crippled forward elevator had been planked over, and she resumed flight operations. But some of her aviation gasoline tanks had been breached, and unknown to anyone, she was on something of a ticking clock. At 0950, Mitscher receives further reports of aircraft trying to take off from Guam, but he recalls the combat air patrols over the island, as although they've done great work in disrupting these efforts so far, there's also preliminary radar information of incoming carrier strike aircraft. At 1000, this data is confirmed as the radar screens on Admiral Lee's battleships begin to show dozens of contacts closing fast. Aboard Mitscher's carriers, every available fighter, or aircraft that can act like a fighter, and still on deck, is flagged for takeoff as soon as possible. And strike aircraft, on various decks, will be ordered to fly off to the eastern side of the fleet and orbit there. About 200 Hellcats thus begin to swarm into the skies. It's now 10:10, and the first Japanese strike force has made a critical error. They've spent the last 10 minutes orbiting out at 70 miles from their target to close up and regroup their formations. If they continued to close, then at this stage they'd only be 20 to 30 miles out from the US formation, with only a few Hellcats just gotten off the deck and struggling for altitude and a minimal combat air patrol. Instead, they only recommence closing in now. This buys precious time for the scrambling US air groups to get off the deck and gain altitude. At 10:15, the first Hellcats from the initial combat air patrol dive into the Japanese formation, 60 miles out from Admiral Lee's battle line. Over the next 30 minutes, elements of no less than 7 different US Navy squadrons would rake the Japanese attackers, 5 of the squadrons coming from the light carriers. At 10:30, back over to the west, the Hyo, Junyo, and Ryuho begin to launch 47 aircraft in response to reports of a second American carrier formation, these reports having been received about half an hour earlier. At 10:35, the scattered remains of the first Japanese strike force now arrive over Admiral Lee's battleships and begin making final attack runs. Curtains of anti-aircraft fire burst around them, and the US Combat Air Patrol breaks off as Japanese aircraft begin to fall, burning, into the sea. One does manage a direct hit on USS South Dakota with a bomb, but that's pretty much the extent of their accomplishments as the survivors pull out of anti-aircraft range, only to be pounced on again by Hellcats that had the fuel to wait out the attack and hit the Japanese once more. Meanwhile, the first US fighters to reach the combat zone mostly are skirting around Admiral Lee's formation to try and get back to their carriers, as a handful that try to take the shortest way home, over the battleships, are fired upon. In the adrenaline-fueled atmosphere, any radial engine aircraft heading towards the battleships is, rather understandably, assumed to be hostile until proven otherwise. Either now or in the second attack, the accounts and sources vary, Indiana takes a hit from a B-6N, which is shot down moments before it can release its torpedo. The weapon wheels away harmlessly, but the aircraft itself smacks into the battleship's waterline, leaving a small dent to mark its passing. A number of near misses do manage to cause some minor damage to US ships. For example, the Minneapolis has one officer's bed and spare clothes set on fire by hot splinters that punch through the hull plating. But overall, one Hellcat pilot from the Lexington summed up the combat thus. The enemy planes had been pretty well chopped down, but a substantial number remained. It didn't look like we would score a grand slam. I reported this information back to base. The sky appeared to be full of smoke and pieces of planes, and we were trying to ride herd on the remaining attacking planes and keep them from scattering. Another meatball broke formation up ahead and I slid over onto his tail, again working in close because of my oil-smeared windscreen. I gave him a short burst and it was enough. It went right into the sweet spot at the root of his wing tanks. The pilot control cables must have been hit also because the burning plane twisted crazily out of control. In spite of our efforts, some of the Jills were beginning to descend to begin their torpedo runs, and the remaining Judies were at the point of peeling off to go down with their bombs. I headed for a group of 3 Judies in a long column. By the time I reached the tail ender, we were almost over our outer screen of ships, but still fairly high. The first Judy was about to begin his dive, and as he started to nose over, I noticed black puffs beside him in the sky. Our 5 inchers were beginning to open up. Foolishly, maybe, I overtook the nearest one. It seemed I barely touched the trigger, and his engine started coming to pieces. The Judy started smoking, then torching alternately off and on as it disappeared below. The next one was about 1/5 of the way down in his dive, trying for one of the destroyers before I caught up with him. This time a short burst produced astonishing results. Number 6 blew up with a tremendous explosion right in front of my face. I must have hit his bomb. I've seen planes blow up before, but never like this. I yanked the stick up sharply to avoid the scattered pieces and flying hot stuff, then radioed, "Splash number 6. There's one more ahead, and he's headed for a battleship, but I don't think he'll make it." Hardly had the words left my mouth than the Judy caught a direct hit that removed it immediately as a factor to be worried about in the war. He'd run into a solid curtain of steel from the battle wagon. Looking around at that point, only Hellcat seemed to be remaining in the sky. Glancing backward to where we'd begun, in a pattern 35 miles long, there were flaming oil slicks in the water and smoke still hanging in the air. It didn't seem like 8 minutes. It seemed longer. But that's all it was, an 8-minute opportunity for the flight of a lifetime. At 1100, the bulk of US pilots are landing back on their carriers. Their aircraft are quickly being refueled and rearmed, as the day is far from over. Fresh combat air patrol formations are sent skyward. Meanwhile, far to the west, all the operational Japanese large carrier groups form up and launch whatever aircraft they have left. This turns out to be 84 in total, which form a 4th wave that's sent after a contact that's reported 120 miles south of Admiral Lee's position. At 11:07, radar aboard the carrier Lexington spots the 109 remaining aircraft from the second attack wave, the one launched from the Japanese fleet carriers, heading their way. Like the preceding attack, the Japanese aircraft waste precious minutes orbiting out of anti-aircraft range to rearrange their formations. VF-15 and VF-16 are ordered to intercept, while more fighters are ordered into the skies. At 11:39, 40 miles out from the carriers, the leading American aircraft hit the incoming Japanese formation head-on. Dozens more Hellcats are on their way, many having flown already against the first attack wave. The first American losses of this round actually come from their own eagerness. Several Hellcats enter steep climbs with incorrect settings on their superchargers, or else strain their propellers until the governors blow. Either case sends the pilots back down into the sea without managing to get to grips with their opponents. The battle now drifts into range of the US Navy's ships, and long-range anti-aircraft fire begins to stitch the sky. One pilot was treated to the sight of a Judy strike aircraft sweeping past him, opening the range far too fast for his aircraft to get a shot off, only to disintegrate into confetti as a 5-inch shell landed a direct hit and blew the aircraft to smithereens. At 11:45, possibly out of desperation as their formations were being cut apart, most of the surviving Japanese aircraft cut short any attempt to reach the carriers of Task Group 58.2 and instead go after Admiral Lee's battleships again. Once more, the capital ships fill the skies with anti-aircraft fire, and this time they make it through without sustaining any direct hits at all. Only half a dozen Judies from the initial part of this attack wave keep to their original mission. But it's to no avail, as they fail to score any direct hits on the carriers, although they do manage to land a number of damaging near misses to the Bunker Hill and inflict very light damage to Wasp. At 11:54, more aircraft from the rear echelons of this attack wave begin to trickle in. These are going after the Enterprise, one of whose gunners noted that Princeton was right there, 2,000 yards away, but they all wanted a piece of us. However, the veteran carrier was up to the task of evasion and self-defense, taking down 2 of the aircraft mid-attack and forcing others to break off, dealing with the last aircraft by blowing off its starboard wing, which fluttered gently into the sea some time after the rest of the unfortunate attacker. A few of the very last Japanese aircraft ultimately did try to go for Princeton, but they accomplished nothing. At 1200, or noon, USS Kavala, having long pursued the Japanese fleet, now found itself looking at an aircraft carrier. After some debate as to if they'd accidentally wandered into a US task group or not, the sight of a rising sun flag seals the deal, and her 6 torpedo tubes are fired. The last one was fired in something of a hurry, as escorting destroyers are charging her down, having spotted the periscope wake. Unfortunately for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the lookouts aboard the carrier, which turns out to be Shikaku, are somewhat less on the ball than their escort, and they only spot the torpedoes at the last minute, far too late to evade. The carrier is hit by at least 3 of the 6 torpedoes, and this turns the ship into a fireball as aviation gas tanks are ignited, not helped by the fact that she'd just recovered aircraft and was refueling them, so the aviation gasoline transportation system is fully stocked. The crew race to control both fires and flooding as the carrier begins to heel dangerously. At 12:11, with the radar screens clearing once again over the US formation, VF-14 and VF-28 are ordered up to combat air patrol duty, while the US Navy's other Hellcat pilots once more return to refuel and rearm. The newly arrived combat air patrol is kept busy chasing down odd lone Japanese aircraft that hang around looking for opportunities to get one last attack in, but ultimately only 31 of the over 100 attackers from this wave would manage to return either to Guam or to their carriers. At 12:25, Task Group 58.4 spots the 3rd Japanese raid, which wanders back and forth, having launched on one vector but then been told to divert to a new contact mid-flight. After some time watching the erratic behaviour, which they first suspect might be a decoy formation, combat air patrol fighters are sent in to investigate. At 13:01, fighters from Hornet make first contact with the latest Japanese attackers, claiming a number of kills for no losses. At 13:20, a handful of Zeros loaded with bombs make it to the Essex, but miss. This marks a lackluster and brief encounter with the 3rd attack wave. At 13:30, Hellcats are vectored out on what's thought to be the rest of the 3rd wave. But the contacts turn out to be a cloud, this having come from a radar whose sensitivity was perhaps set a little bit too high, and the other contact turns out to be the island of Guam, this coming from a radar array that was perhaps aiming itself a little bit too low. The lack of movement on the part of Guam should also have given it away, but better safe than sorry. Having determined, however, that a handful of 50 cals were unlikely to be able to send the entirety of Guam to Davy Jones' locker, and in any case the US actually wanted Guam intact, relatively speaking, the pilots turned back. Scout aircraft are launched in an attempt to locate the Japanese fleet. At 14:15, having headed to their assigned target and found nothing, elements of the 4th wave of Japanese aircraft, which had turned back for home at this point, actually spot Task Group 58.2 and begin closing immediately for an attack. Due to a faulty radio aboard USS Monterey, which has spotted them, as well as confusion over the exact nature of the contacts due to their approach from an unexpected direction, the US fighter response is last-minute and patchy. USS Cabo launches its ready aircraft, but they need to climb 12,000 feet to make the intercept. The Combat Air Patrol, based on the attack altitude of the previous Japanese attackers, is flying at 25,000 feet. They now face the opposite problem. They need to descend quite a long way, and quite quickly, without overspeeding and locking up their controls. In the end, only USS Wasp's VF-14 actually manages to make contact, taking out 3 aircraft before Japanese aircraft cross into anti-aircraft range of the carriers and their escorts. At 14:20, Somewhat understandably concerned, the ships of Task Group 58.2 begin evading every which way, causing Cabo's captain to let loose with a series of colourful phrases as ships keep getting in the way of his attempts to launch more fighters. But in the end, the attack accomplishes little. Between the wild evasion of the US ships, well-aimed anti-aircraft fire, and the Japanese pilots' inexperience, the only casualties of the engagement are a handful of VF-14 crew who are soaked by the water from a near miss. Another man aboard Wasp is hit by a burning piece of white phosphorus and mildly injured. 4 Oerlikon gunners are knocked over by a piece of a Judy that they just shot down, but they get back up again almost immediately. And 1 Hellcat pilot on Bunker Hill finds himself pitched overboard with his aircraft when the carrier makes a sharp turn and it turns out the brakes aren't quite up to the task. Luckily, a nearby destroyer sees the accident and races to pick him up. Around 1430, way back over to the west, despite their best efforts, the crew of Taiho have unknowingly ended up turning their carrier into a giant fuel-air explosive bomb, as vapour from the ruptured fuel tanks has spread throughout the ship. Now the inevitable happens. A lone spark somewhere sets it off, and the pride of the Imperial Japanese carrier fleet explodes and sinks in short order. At 1500 or thereabouts, amidst the fires, a bomb on Shikaku explodes. Like Taiho, this sets off various gathered fuel vapours, and a massive fireball also marks the rapid end of this ship, which also sinks shortly thereafter. At 1510, as various scattered Japanese aircraft groups try to land on Guam, patrolling Hellcats pick off many of them. This has been going on for a while now, but it begins to reach its peak as the last survivors of the Japanese assault waves make their final approaches to what should have been a refuge, but instead is crawling with yet more of Grumman Iron Works' latest output. At 1530, the US carriers recover their aircraft once again, and Admirals Mitchell and Spruance try to make sense of the situation, requesting loss and kill estimates from each carrier. The US carriers still had some time before they could turn west and pursue the Japanese, as the wind still dictated they had to sail east to launch and recover aircraft. At 1630, Spruance orders attack plans prepared for the next day, and once aircraft recovery is complete, orders course set westward. Meanwhile, although only having around 150 or so aircraft left scattered between Guam and what remains of his fleet, Ozawa is actually contemplating renewing the action, partly because he'd been ordered to, partly because his pilots told him that despite the great losses, they had hit and potentially sunk many American ships, and partially because he was unaware of just how badly the Guam-based aircraft had been eaten away by US attacks. Notice that they really haven't featured much during the day's events. But for now, the Japanese forces withdraw northwest. It's now 0200 on the 20th of June, 1944, and in the darkness of the early morning hours, a handful of radar-equipped US night fighters are prowling, taking out a handful of Japanese aircraft that are operating for some reason over the airfields of Rota and Guam. At 0530, US scouts are launched en masse, finding and downing some Japanese scout aircraft, but not finding any targets. As this incident would suggest, the Japanese have also been launching their own scout aircraft. The US forces were hopeful. They didn't know that Shikaku had sunk, and they were hoping, therefore, that her damaged form would be slowing the Japanese formations down. These searches would continue throughout the day, but for the most of it, they didn't turn up anything. At 1512, though, a garbled report reaches the US fleet indicating the possible position of Japanese forces. At 1540, a clearer report establishes the reported position of the Japanese carriers. The reported position equates to about 230 nautical miles away from the American ships. It's right at the very edge of strike range, just beyond it, technically speaking, for some aircraft, and now the decision has to be made about whether to launch an attack late in the afternoon or to wait for another day. But by 1600, Mitchell and Spruance have come to a quick decision. They agree it's now or never, and they order an immediate strike. 240 aircraft are soon being prepared for launch, while the pilots rush to their briefings. At 16:10, the first briefings are over and the first pilots climb aboard their aircraft. At 16:24, the first aircraft leave the flight deck. Of the aircraft that are launched, 14 have to turn back for various reasons, mostly mechanical. This leaves 95 Hellcats, 54 Avengers, and 77 dive bombers, a mix of Helldivers and Dauntlesses, heading west, with a number of the Avengers also carrying bombs instead of torpedoes. At 17:15, Ozawa receives his own scouting report. This places the US carriers just over 300 miles to his east. This range estimate is actually somewhat more accurate than the one the US has just launched on, although, of course, neither side knows that yet. At 17:20, with darkness approaching, Mitchell receives another scouting report. This indicates that the enemy formation is, in fact, about 60 miles further away than was originally thought. He orders a second wave, which has been sitting around prepared on deck, to stand down. It's clear that it's going to be hard enough to recover the first wave, let alone one that now will face taking off, flying, attacking, and returning in darkness well beyond their official strike range. But, crucially, he doesn't order the first wave to turn back. At 18:05, or around about this time, Helldivers from WASP spot the Japanese refueling formation. Running short on fuel, VB-14 decides to go after them. Their attack takes out 2 precious fleet oilers and damages another one. At 18:20, the rest of the US formation spots Ozawa's carriers another 35 miles beyond the refueling formation, and begins their attack runs. The Japanese' own radar has spotted the US aircraft almost 20 minutes earlier, but the Japanese carriers have spent most of that intervening time simply scrambling as many fighters as possible. By 18:40, the US aircraft have arrived over Ozawa's fleet, and they begin their assault. They've got about 20 minutes before the last of the evening light fades. Zeros sweep in and are countered by Hellcats. Aircraft begin falling on both sides as bombs and torpedoes also rain down. At 18:50, the Japanese fleet twists and turns as the attack builds to a crescendo. One of Hornet's pilots described his attack dive thus: "As I pushed over into my dive at about 12,000 feet, the anti-aircraft fire became so intense that I saw no way of getting through it. My dive brakes were already open, and I was well into a good dive, but because of the potent defensive fire, I felt like I was moving in slow motion in quicksand. At this point, I did something I'd never done before in a dive. I closed my dive brakes. My plane responded by dropping like a stone toward the target below, leaving the heavy anti-aircraft fire behind. My speed was building up, and, in the clean condition without flaps, I could never expect to pull out of the dive. Shouting a prayer to my guardian angel, at 6,000 feet I placed the dive brake selector back into the open position. The wing brakes did what no manufacturing specs said they would. They actually opened. It was as if a giant hand had grabbed my plane by the tail, my headlong plunge slowed, and there was an enemy carrier dead in my sight below me, turning into my flight path along its lengthwise axis. At a point-blank range of 2,000 feet, I unleashed my bomb. The strike aircraft managed to land damaging hits on the carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and Chiyoda, as well as the battleship Haruna. Zuikaku is almost abandoned when her aviation fuel supplies catch fire, billowing smoke actually persuading American aircraft to go after other carriers as they think she's surely done for. But her crew succeed in bringing the situation under control, eventually. At 19:04, VB-16, still flying the good old Dauntless, scores the biggest kill of the evening, or at least they begin to score it, as they send bombs raining down on and around the Hio. Moments later, a VT-24 Avenger seals the deal by sending a torpedo into the carrier's side. The mortally wounded carrier staggers off into the darkness. At 19:10, with the attack over, US air crews begin to form up for the long journey home. Around 20 of their number have been lost in the attack, but now they have to fight the navigational hazards of a night with no moon, at sea, and their own dwindling fuel supplies, if they want to get home. At 2015, radar operators on the US ships begin to notice contacts heading back towards them. Most are heading in the rough direction of the carriers, but some are wandering far too far north or south. The US carriers had prepared for this. Mitcher's orders were, at his signal, to power on their running lights and other outlining light sources with a searchlight per carrier aimed straight upwards as a beacon. The fleet had also kept on heading west to close the distance with their aircraft. For some, this would be just enough. For others, though, it wasn't, and small groups of aircraft were already ditching, mostly staying close together for mutual support. At 2030, with Mitcher having yet to give his order to illuminate the ships, USS Hornet decides it's going to do so anyway, and includes every single searchlight that she has lighting up the skies. Jocko Clark, aboard Hornet, also orders his escorting cruisers to commence firing Starshell. The destroyers in Task Group 58.1 think this is a brilliant idea, and so they begin to shine all their searchlights on whatever carrier they happen to be closest to. Admiral Mitcher, spotting an increasing carnival, orders the rest of the carrier forces to do the same, and soon the struggling pilots, still airborne, are gifted with the sight of their home ships lit up like beacons. Not especially caring which flight deck they aim for, pilots, flying more on hopes and dreams than actual fuel, head for whatever carrier happens to be nearest. LSOs, landing signal officers, sometimes have to wave off aircraft when several try to land at once, and in some cases, the aircraft don't listen. Between inexperience at night landings and the final vapours of fuel giving out, 80 or so aircraft end up not returning to the hangars that night, either ditching at sea in the middle of the US formation, or being scraped over the side after catastrophic landings. The smaller ships scour the sea looking for the ditched pilots and aircrew. Losing 100 aircraft in total was irritating, but there were always going to be more where those came from. But trained aircrew are another matter. Over the course of that night, and over the next couple of days, many of the ditched aircrew will in fact be found and rescued, but some would become the tragic casualties of a high-risk roll of the dice. At 2050, Lieutenant Commander Harmer aboard USS Enterprise takes off in a radar-equipped Corsair night fighter. He has a plan. Heading out under the direction of the ship's radar officer, and then using his own radar once he's got close enough, he manages to track down 3 separate groups of aircraft that had gotten very badly lost, and leads them back to the fleet. Pete Alrand from the Bunker Hill, in a radar-equipped Hellcat, does likewise. Some of the aircraft that these pilots pick up are 50 or 60 miles away from where they should be. At 2100, the carrier Hio falls victim to the same issue that's already claimed Taiho and Shikaku. A build-up of aviation fuel fumes is sparked off by something, which leaves her ablaze in a massive explosion. Shortly thereafter, she also sinks beneath the waves. At 2252, the last aircraft lands aboard the US carriers. The carriers then go dark to avoid potential attack by submarines, but the destroyers stay lit up, scanning the water with their searchlights for the numerous aircrew who are at this point still in the water. Elsewhere in the fleet, especially on cruisers equipped with float planes, initial preparations are being made for aerial search and rescue operations to be launched as soon as the pre-dawn light allows. One mildly amusing aside comes in the form of a Val dive bomber, which had inexplicably somehow ended up among the US formation and was witnessed by multiple carrier crews making repeated landing attempts on multiple US carriers before vanishing off into the night shortly before the last US aircraft made it onto the deck. It seems very implausible, and indeed in most cases one would write it off, except for the fact that exactly the same aircraft of exactly the same make with exactly the same markings was reported across multiple carriers in different task groups. But with that, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later to be dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, is officially over. In total, the 2 days of battle had cost the US Navy 123 aircraft. 23 aircraft lost on the first day during the defense of the fleet, and 100 the following day during the attack on the Japanese carriers, although as we noted, most of those were lost due to lack of fuel on the way back. Of those 100 aircraft that went down on the second day, 100 pilots, of course, and 109 aircrew had been in those aircraft. But after rescue efforts, total losses amounted to 16 pilots and 22 aircrew, plus, of course, some casualties which had been suffered aboard the fleet, particularly on South Dakota with that bomb hit on the first day. And some of the pilots from that first day had also not made it. Conversely, the Japanese had lost 3 carriers, 2 oilers, and somewhere around 600 aircraft, along with most of the pilots and aircrew. Although the Japanese surface fleet had escaped largely unscathed except for Haruna, 2 of their biggest and best carriers were gone, and the other one was damaged, and almost their entire rebuilt carrier air groups were once more gone. The landings on Saipan had continued untouched by external interference. Despite some in the US fleet being disappointed that a more dramatic action had not been fought, it was simply the case that the losses were hopelessly one-sided in their favour, and Spruance's overall strategic objectives had, in fact, been met. Of course, some would immediately judge Spruance rather harshly for failing to completely and utterly destroy the enemy fleet. Admiral Towers would even petition to have Spruance relieved of command for not winning hard enough. Towers, of course, naturally put himself forward as the replacement, but Admirals Nimitz and King resisted his calls rather vociferously. They were well aware of what had been at stake, and as reports were tallied up, they were also well aware of just how much Spruance had actually won. In hindsight, of course, it's easy to point out that the landing situation on Saipan was in fact going better than had initially been reported at the time, and therefore the transports as a whole could potentially have been sent east earlier, freeing up the US fleet to head straight in for a decisive action without having to double back towards Saipan on the night of the 19th. But that would be to make decisions based on information that Spruance not only didn't have, but is in fact running counter to the information which he did have at the time. Although the threat of the Imperial Japanese Navy had not been completely ended, the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force had been well and truly broken, leaving the Japanese fleet unable to seriously influence the course of US operations until their last roll of the dice during the invasion of the Philippines at the close of the year. For now, though, Spruance had to make sure that the Marianas were secured, including that rather annoying Guam, and so he turned his mind back to that task.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.